In 2012, a 22-year-old woman named Simone was living in a small winemaking village called Rüdesheim am Rhein, which is located in southwestern Germany. This village is strikingly beautiful. It's full of quaint European homes, and there's lots of rolling green hills with vineyards as far as the eye can see, and the village sits right on the banks of the Rhine River. Simone had grown up in this picturesque village, and she had loved it, but this was going to be her last summer before she left and headed off to New York City to start the next chapter of her life. And while she was excited about that, she was also kind of sad because this village and everybody inside of it were the only things she had ever known. And so the idea of leaving them behind just seemed very strange to her. But instead of focusing on the kind of growing anxiety around her imminent departure from Germany, she focused on what she would be doing that summer while she was still in Germany. Some of Simone's fondest memories of her childhood were of her time spent at summer camp. And this summer camp was located in this forest that was not far from her village. And every summer in July, Simone, along with about 200 other kids from her village and from neighboring villages, would converge on the campgrounds in the forest for 2 weeks of playing games and going on scavenger hunts and putting on stage plays and just generally having a really good time. But when Simone became a teenager and was too old to be a camp attendee, she decided she would volunteer and be a camp counselor. And she found it was awesome. She immediately connected with the other camp counselors, and she felt all grown up, having a real job, and she loved goofing around with all of the kids. And so every summer since that first time volunteering, Simone had gone back and volunteered again. And this summer was no different. So in mid-July of that year, Simone packed up her things and she headed off to the forest. The way this camp worked was the 200 plus kids that were attending the camp, they would get dropped off in the mornings each day by their parents, and they'd play and run around all day. And then in the late afternoon, their parents would come back and pick them up. So none of the kids were sleeping over at the camp during these 2 weeks. However, the 30 plus counselors, they would just stay at the camp for the full 2 weeks. They would just sleep in tents out in the forest. Technically, the reason they did this was to make sure they had enough time in the morning to prep the campgrounds for the kids, and then also in the evenings to have enough time to clean up and kind of have it ready for the next day. But in reality, Simone and the other counselors all knew that the camping out in the forest was the best part of the volunteer experience. After all the kids went home for the night, all of the counselors would finish up all of their duties and then rush off into the forest where their tents were and where there was a fire pit, and they would have some beers and wine because the legal drinking age in Germany is actually 16. So all these counselors are having a couple of drinks, and then before long they'd be laughing and telling stories and just generally having a great time. So that July in 2012, Simone and the other counselors arrived at the campgrounds a day early, and they caught up with each other and they prepared the campground. And then the next morning, all the kids showed up and everything went off without a hitch. And then that afternoon, after all the kids had been picked up by their parents, Simone and the other counselors rushed to finish up all their duties and then headed off into the woods to enjoy their first night hanging out together. After a couple of beers had been passed around the campfire, everybody was in good spirits and laughing and telling stories. But pretty quickly, people started to fade and get tired because, it was their first day back at camp and it had been a long, tiring day. And so people very gradually began retiring to their tents to go to bed. And eventually Simone, too, had crawled into her tent and gotten onto her cot to try to sleep herself. But she found that night it was so hot she couldn't be in her tent. It was stifling inside of there. And so she decides she's just going to sleep out in the open where it's a little bit cooler. And so she picks up her fold-up cot and she brings it out into the open, and she sees there are several other counselors who have done the same thing. And so she puts her cot down next to one of her good friends who's already asleep in her cot. And then Simone climbs into her cot, she gets under her covers, and she tries to fall asleep. But for the next hour, Simone just tosses and turns, she can't get comfortable, and by that time, everybody else has completely passed out. So it's just her, she's counting down the time until she has to get up again to start the next day, and so she's getting stressed about that. But eventually, she would fall asleep. However, she would immediately be thrust into one of the most visceral and intense nightmares she had ever had in her entire life. In her dream, she opens her eyes and she looks out in front of her, and it's this desert city, and there are hundreds of people all in front of her, just standing there looking up at her. And then she notices on her left and on her right are these two men, these big, huge men that are both working on something behind her. She doesn't really know what it is, but they're obviously busy doing something. And she kind of glances up at one of them and she notices he's holding something that looks like a wreath, like a holiday wreath you would hang on your door. And so Simone looks away from the guy with the wreath and just looks back out at this huge sea of people, which is totally bizarre because no one's moving, no one's making any sound, they're just staring at her. And then she feels this shooting pain in the top of her head. The man who was standing on her right was not holding a holiday wreath. He was holding a crown of thorns, and now he, along with the guy on the other side of her, were working together to press this crown of thorns into her head. And so Simone is feeling the thorns being pressed deeper and deeper into her scalp, and she tries to fight them off, but she realizes she can't move. She can't even turn her head to look at them. She can only see them out of her periphery vision. And then she tries to scream out for help to someone in the crowd to come help her, but when she opens her mouth, no sound comes out. And so as she's sitting there, all she can do is stare straight out ahead of her as the pressure of these thorns are driven deeper and deeper into her skin. And then at some point, blood begins dripping down in front of her eyes. And around that point, the pain became so blinding, so awful that it woke her up. And as soon as she woke up, she shot up and she reached for her head to make sure there was no crown of thorns on her. And as she's doing that, she's thinking, okay, phew, it was just a dream. That was just a horrible dream. I'm in this forest. I'm good. I'm safe. And as she's kind of patting on her head, she's realizing her head is wet. And as she's touching her head, she's realizing it hurts. There's a stinging pain in her head. And then she realizes it's not just a stinging pain, it's a throbbing, intense pain all over her head. And so as she's kind of having this realization that her dream is now kind of segued into her real life, she looks out ahead of her and she sees off in the distance in the tree line, something is running through the woods. She can't tell who or what it is, but she makes a mental note that there is someone running away from them. But this pain in her head has gotten so intense that she can't focus on anything else. She can only focus on the pain. And as she's thinking about how much her head hurts, she screams in pain. And the girl who was laying next to her that had been asleep, she wakes up to the sound of the scream, but it's totally pitch black. She has no idea what's going on with Simone. And so this girl, she sits up and she's trying to get Simone to tell her what's going on, but Simone has no idea. She's totally frantic. She can't really make sense of what's happening. And so this friend, she reaches down and she picks up a flashlight, she turns it on, and she aims the light at Simone, illuminating her head. And when this friend sees Simone's head, she starts to scream. Seconds later, the rest of the counselors that had been sleeping out were awake, and they were rushing Simone, who was now shaking and vomiting, over to one of the staff vans. And then 15 minutes later, they had driven her to the emergency room. It would turn out, after Simone had finally fallen asleep and she began having that really intense dream about a crown of thorns being dug into her scalp, well, in reality, something was digging into her scalp and it was kind of manifesting itself in her dream. And what was digging into her scalp was the jaws of a fox. This fox had snuck into the campsite and walked right up behind Simone and just started eating her head. And amazingly, it did not wake Simone up right away. And so this fox got 20 or so serious bites out of Simone's head before she shot up and scared it away. And so almost certainly what Simone saw running away from her in that quick moment was the fox. Doctors were able to save Simone and stitch her head back together, and they were even able to hide all of the scars in her hairline so you can't even see them. But despite her being physically okay today, psychologically, this was a very traumatizing event. Not only does she refuse now to go into any forest, whether it's day or night, but she also periodically still gets phantom pains in her scalp that feels like the fox is biting her head all over. On a warm summer night in 1998, a 7-year-old boy named Tyler Florian fell asleep watching TV on his living room couch. Tyler lived with his parents as well as his older brother, Will, who was 10 years old, in a modest 2-story home in a rural neighborhood in West Virginia. That night, Tyler's father, who normally tucked the boys in at night, was out for work. And so after Tyler fell asleep, it was his mother who gently woke him up and encouraged him to head upstairs to his room. And so Tyler, he gets off the couch and he's groggy and he makes his way over to the stairs. He climbs up the stairs and he turns right and heads down the hallway to his room. He goes into his bedroom, he climbs into his bed, and then he falls asleep. In order to understand what happens next, you need to have a good understanding of the layout of the second floor hallway. That hallway stretched from the front of the house all the way to the back of the house. And at either end of this hallway were doors that led outside of the house, and these doors had big windows on them. The front of the house, that door, if you walked out it, you'd be walking out onto a balcony that overlooked the front yard of the property. But if you walked out the back door of this second floor hallway, you would not be walking onto a balcony. You would not even be on the second floor. You'd be basically stepping into the backyard of the house. And the reason for this is because the house was built into a hill. And so the back half of the house is literally underground. It's in the hill. And so there is no door on the lower half of the house because there's just earth behind the door. And so it's that second floor doorway at the end of the hall that serves as kind of like the exit to the backyard of the house. So with that in mind, Tyler, he gets upstairs, he goes to his bedroom, which is towards the front half of this hallway, and he falls asleep. And then only about an hour after falling asleep, he wakes up to the sound of someone using the bathroom. Tyler's bedroom was positioned right across the hall from the bathroom, and his door was open. And so Tyler's laying on his bed, he opens his eyes, and he's looking through his open door at the bathroom. And the bathroom, the door is shut, but he can see there's light coming out from underneath the bottom of the door, so he knows someone's in there. And so Tyler's just laying there watching whoever is in there. He's assuming it's his brother, who has a habit of going to the bathroom in the middle of the night. And so he's just kind of watching, and then at some point he hears the flick of the light as it's turned off, and he sees the light disappear from inside of the bathroom. The door swings open, and sure enough, it's his brother who steps back into the hallway. His brother looks into Tyler's room, but doesn't attempt to interact with Tyler. Instead, Will just turns and walks back down the hallway towards his bedroom. And so as Tyler is listening to the sound of his brother's footsteps fade down the hallway, he closes his eyes again and prepares to go back to sleep. But as he's laying there with his eyes closed, he can tell that his brother has stopped short of his bedroom and has turned around and is now walking back up the hallway towards the bathroom and towards Tyler's room. And so Tyler opens his eyes again because he knows his brother is about to be right in front of his bedroom, and he's thinking, okay, maybe he forgot something in the bathroom. And so Tyler decides to just watch to see what his brother does. And so sure enough, Will walks all the way up until he's standing right in front of Tyler's open door, but instead of going into the bathroom, Will walks into Tyler's room. And right away, Tyler sits up and says, hey, what are you doing? What's going on? And his brother, he pauses for a second and he begins to say something that sounds like he saw something out there, but, he's hesitant. He doesn't really know how he wants to frame the thing he wants to say. And so Tyler's like, come on, what are you doing? It's the middle of the night. What's going on? And finally, Will just blurts out, I keep seeing a man wearing stripes at the end of the hallway. And so Tyler, he hears this and he can't compute what he's being told. And so he just says, what? What are you talking about, Will? What did you see in the hallway? And Will would say again, I keep seeing a man wearing stripes at the end of the hallway. I've seen him a couple times in the last couple of days. I go to the bathroom, and then when I start walking back, I see him outside the back door in our backyard. And so Tyler is so scared because his brother does not sound like he's making a joke. His brother sounds like he's telling the truth. And just the fact that his brother can't quite find the words to describe what he saw made it seem even more real. And so Tyler, he gets out of bed and he says, Will, we gotta go tell Mom. But that required going into the hallway and going down the hall towards where apparently this man in stripes was to get to their mother's bedroom. And so Will, who initially was not that scared of this man in stripes he had seen, was now starting to get pretty panicked in seeing Tyler's reaction to this. And so Will tells Tyler, stay right there, stay in the room. And so Will, he kind of peeks back into the hallway and he looks all the way down, and there is no man in stripes anymore. There's no one in the hall. And so he tells Tyler Tyler, the coast is clear, and the two of them run down the hallway all the way right in front of that door that leads into the back of the property where the man in stripes was, and they turn left and they go into their parents' bedroom where just their mother was because their father was out of town. And so they charge in there, they wake their mom up, and they're talking over each other, trying to communicate to their mom that there was a ghost, that there was an intruder, that there was something bad happening around their house. And so finally their mom just tells them to be quiet, and she says, okay, boys, sit on the bed. I'm gonna go have a look around the house. And so the two boys do as they're told. They sit on the bed, and their mom leaves the bedroom. She goes into the hallway, and she looks immediately to her left where the man in stripes supposedly was, and she doesn't see anything. She just looks out into their backyard. There's nothing there. She looks down the other direction, out the front of the house, doesn't see anything. She walks all around the house. She goes outside. She looks everywhere, but she doesn't see anyone or anything. And so eventually she comes back inside the house. She goes up to the second floor. She goes back to her bedroom, and she tells her boys, look, you probably just spooked yourselves. There is no man in stripes. You're totally safe. You're totally fine. Just go back to bed. You probably just imagined whatever you saw. And so Will, who was the one who saw the man in stripes, was very quick to accept his mother's answer. It actually seemed like it was a relief to have somebody tell him that what you had seen wasn't real. And so he very happily went back to his bed and he fell asleep. But Tyler, who had not seen the man in stripes, but had a very intense reaction to hearing his brother describe it, could not accept his mother's answer. It just totally freaked him out because his brother was always joking around about stuff, but this did not feel like a joke. This felt very, very real. But over the course of the next couple of days, weeks, months, years, Will never claimed to see the man in stripes again, and so pretty quickly, Tyler forgot about it. Fast forward 11 years to 2009, so Tyler is now 18 years old, and he and his mom were out in the car running some errands. And as they're driving around, they were just chatting about all sorts of different things, and at some point they began talking about one of their beloved family pets, a dog named Max that they had when Tyler was really young. And so as they're kind of swapping stories about all the goofy things that this dog did, Tyler's mom suddenly says, hey, Tyler, do you remember the time that I opened the front door to let the cops into the house, and Max came bounding into the house, and he went right into the kitchen and he ripped open all the food? And Tyler's looking at his mom like, wait, when did the cops come to our house? When did you open the door to let the cops come into our house? And as soon as Tyler said this to his mom looked at him as if she had just given away something she hadn't meant to, and then she kind of relaxed and said, you know what? I never got around to telling you. Now that I'm thinking about it, you and your brother were asleep, and you didn't even know this happened. And then afterward, me and your father decided not to tell you guys because we didn't want to scare you. Back when you were about 7 years old and Will was about 10 years old, your dad was away at work, and we were all asleep one night when suddenly I wake up to the sound of someone or something moving around outside of our house. And so I sit up in bed and I go into the hallway and I look left and I look out that door into our backyard, and I see standing up against the glass this man with his hands pressed to the window looking into the house. And so Tyler's mom would tell him how she totally freaked out and she flipped on the lights and it scared this guy who ran off, and then she called the police, and then the police showed up, and that's when their dog Max came bounding inside and shredded the bag of food. And the police, they searched the property, but apparently they never found this guy. Tyler's mom would go on to tell him that the police warned her that her description of this man that was standing at their back door matched the description of a man who was wanted for murder who was on the loose in the area. Tyler was dumbfounded. He didn't remember this because obviously he had been asleep, because this is something he would have remembered. And so he had so many questions about this whole situation. But the first question he asked his mom was, well, what did he look like? And his mom said, well, he was tall, he had dark hair, he had blue jeans on, and oh, you know what? He had a striped shirt on. It would turn out, for a couple of days in the summer of 1998, this suspected murderer who was on the run from police had apparently been hiding out on Tyler's family's property, and in the middle of the night, for whatever reason, this suspected murderer would walk over to the back door of the second floor hallway, and he would put his face up to the glass and he would stare into their home. This was the man in stripes that Will claimed to have seen. He was real. Tyler, after making this connection, would follow up with his family members and he would do some digging of his own, but he was never able to figure out who the man in stripes was or what happened to him. Where is it? I heard the door open. I heard the bells, I heard the pot, I heard the footsteps. I saw the door open, I see the thing walk in, I watched it walk down the aisle, I watched it bend over. It's in the room. Where is it? And this is night 1. There's 2 more nights of this, and it gets worse. When I was 16 years old, I was an avid snowboarder. Starting from the time I was like 12 years old, I used to always go snowboarding with the same 2 guys, my 2 very close friends, Wolf and Nick. Every winter, me, Nick, and Wolf would go up to Nick's family's cabin that was up in the White Mountains in New Hampshire. Just snowboard, and it was great. Every time we went up to this cabin in New Hampshire, it would be me, Wolf, Nick, and then Nick's mom and dad. Unexpectedly, leading into my 16-year-old winter, Nick's father passed away. We were actually planning on going on a trip to the mountains that winter. And I remember speaking to Wolf and being like, I don't know if it's even appropriate to ask about this trip, because we knew that Nick was very close to his father, and not to mention, like, every time we went on this particular trip up to the mountains, Nick's dad was always with us, and it just seemed like, how can we possibly now go on this snowboarding trip? Not only is it a low priority item, but just the dynamic is all different now. Nick called us and was like, hey, so we are still going to do the snowboarding trip to the cabin in New Hampshire. And so Wolf and I, we spoke, and we're like, let's just go with it. I mean, maybe they want to do something that is maybe a fond memory of their father, their husband. And so we agreed to go. So he passes away maybe a few months before we end up going up to the mountains. And so the grief was still definitely there, but also just, again, that the dynamic was it was like the elephant in the room, right? Like, as we're driving up, we drove in the same car. Me, Wolf, Nick, and then Nick's mom was driving. It was so apparent that Nick's dad was missing, because he was always in the car with us when we drove up. Anyhow, so we make the trip up to New Hampshire, and we're planning to be up there for 3 days. So the house itself wasn't really a cabin, it was a house. It was a small house. It was on a mountain. And if you think about the way a mountain works, it's a slope. And so in order to have a house level on a mountain, a portion of it needs to be on stilts, right? The portion that's kind of hanging off the mountain. And then the other part of the house is kind of like embedded in the mountain itself. And when you drive up to the house, there's a wraparound porch that goes around the house. The majority of it is on the stilted section of the house, right? So if you're on the wraparound porch, your footsteps are going to echo. Like, you can hear those footsteps because you're above the ground. When you step into the house, you open a door. It actually opens inwardly. There were sleigh bells that were on the door, on the inside of the door. So anytime you open the door, you hear those sleigh bells ringing. And as soon as you step foot into the house, if you took one step into the house, right? So you step on the wraparound porch, you open the door, sleigh bells ring. When you step into the house, your right foot would be in the kitchen. You'd be standing on linoleum. And your left foot would be on shag carpet, which is like the dining room. And that's the way the house is laid out. As soon as you walk in, kitchen on your right, dining room on your left. And if you keep walking, you're going to enter into this living room. And if you turned around in the living room and looked up, you would see a lofted second floor. If you walk into the house, again, your right foot's in the kitchen, your left foot's in the dining room, and you walked as if you were going into that living space, but stopped about halfway across the house, you could look to your right and there'd be one hallway. There's only one hallway. It's a small house. And this hallway is bringing you, call it, into the mountain. If you think about, again, the layout of the house, you have a portion of the house that's sitting in the mountain and a portion of the house that's on stilts. Well, this hallway leads into the section of the house that's in the mountain. And if you go down this hallway and it turns left, it's a short little hallway, it brings you to one room. And that room is where me, Nick, and Wolf would stay every time we went snowboarding at this mountain. That room, if you go into it, it's a corner-fed room. You open the door, and immediately to your right is a bunk bed. I would always sleep on the bottom bunk, and Wolf would sleep on the top bunk. Our feet would be closest to the door. In the center of the room, with the remaining space, because this is not a big room, there was like a queen-size bed. It was like a slightly larger bed that sat basically in all of the free space that was left over in the room. It was sitting right in the middle of the room, and that's where Nick would sleep. So basically the room was completely packed with 3 places to sleep and really not much else. There was a very small space between the queen size bed and the bunk bed, so you could walk between those two, but that was about it. So that layout's very important, and you'll see why. We snowboard for the day, we come back to the cabin, and me, Nick, and Wolf decide we're gonna crash super early and get up early and have a full day of riding ahead of us, because we're avid snowboarders. So we go to our room, the one that's kind of, you go down that hallway and you get to the room I just described. We planned on going to bed early, but we were excited, and so we stayed up gaming for a bit. And then maybe around like 11 or 12 o'clock at night, Nick, who again is in the queen size bed, and Wolf was in the top bunk, they ultimately fall asleep. I was still awake, and what struck me, and it always struck me whenever I slept in this room, is when you turn off all the electronics and you're just laying in bed in this house, in particular this room, it is pitch black. There's no windows. You're in the segment of the house that's, in the mountain. It is truly pitch black. Not to mention the house itself, there weren't really any neighbors nearby, because this house, Nick's family had purchased it a while ago when this used to be an active ski resort, the mountain itself that it was on. But it wasn't anymore, and most people that were living there had left and sold their property. But a few people had decided to stay, and so Nick's family was one of them. So they had this cabin on an abandoned ski resort. There was virtually no streetlights, there's virtually no neighbors, and so at night, when you're laying in this room, like I was this night, you're really struck by just how dark and quiet it is. I mean, basically no white noise, silence and pitch black. And so I'm laying there, and one other detail that needs to be brought up before we get into what actually happens. So Nick had 2 much older brothers. They were in their 30s, and we're 16 years old. And we were expecting one of them, we didn't know which, to swing by the house at some point over the next few days. That's what Nick's mom had said. Nick had kind of reiterated it. And I think that Wolf and I understood that, now that Nick's father was gone, that they were just kind of trying to find a way to fill the void that was left from the father passing. And so we were expecting over the course of that weekend for someone, one of the 2 brothers, to come to this house and stay with us for a night or whatever it was. I had never met either of these 2 brothers. I knew they existed, but I had never met them before. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I know that probably one of them is going to show up at some point, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, whenever it is. Man, it's giving me goosebumps just thinking about this. So that night, as I'm laying in bed, I'm thinking about how dark and quiet it is. I remember the only light in the room was the digital clock, the little red digital clock, and it was like a beacon in the light. And that doesn't emit much light, but when it's pure darkness, it does. And I just could not fall asleep. I remember I got to a place where I started counting how many hours of sleep I might get if I fell asleep right then and there, which is never a good sign. That means you're not close to sleeping. If you're like, okay, if I fell asleep now, I'll get 3 hours and 22 minutes of sleep, right? Like that's where I was at mentally. At some point, I think it was around 3 a.m, I remember looking at the clock and thinking, wow, it's gotten so late and I'm still awake. I hear footsteps on the wraparound porch. In a situation where, as I'm telling it, you're going to think, how did you not raise, a red flag immediately? In real time, in real life, your brain goes to great measures to convince you that everything is okay. It really takes an enormous amount of anomalies to stack up for your brain to say something's wrong. And so that's what happened in this first night. I hear footsteps on the wraparound porch, and I immediately assume, even though we're talking, it's like 3 a.m, I just assume that it's got to be one of Nick's brothers arriving to be a part of this weekend getaway. So I really actually didn't think anything of it. I actually just thought, well, when he comes in the house, if he happens to come in here to check on us, I'll just pretend to be asleep in case, he were to see that I was awake. I don't want to have a conversation with him. Number 1, it's 3 a.m. Number 2, I don't know the guy. I'm just going to pretend to be asleep. So that's all I'm thinking about. Not worried, not scared, not anything. Footsteps on the wraparound porch, and then the door opens, and I can hear the sleigh bells that are on the door itself. I can hear those chime as the door opens. Again, No part of me is concerned about this. I'm thinking it's a little bit weird that they're arriving at 3 a.m, but we knew that his brothers had these weird work schedules where they might show up in the middle of the night. So it was just, it was whatever it was. Sleigh bells ring, and then I hear what sounds like a pot, like a kitchen pot, fall and hit the linoleum floor in the kitchen. And I remember just the sound stood out to me. It just seemed like this person's kind of making a bit of a commotion in the middle of the night here. And the door didn't shut. And I noticed that. I figured they were maybe bringing their stuff in, right? They're offloading some stuff. And they're leaving the door open. Oh, this is, just thinking about this, it's really making me feel uncomfortable. So I hear the footsteps in the wraparound porch, the door opens, I can hear the sleigh bells, a pot falls and it hits the linoleum floor. The footsteps that I could hear on the wraparound porch, because it's on stilts, right? Like the porch is hovering over the ground. You can hear those footsteps. Well, when these footsteps continued into the house, where you're on a concrete slab and there should be no sound, like I shouldn't hear echoing footsteps, it sounded like it was on the wraparound porch still, but the noise was getting closer to me. So it was like the footsteps sounded totally natural out on the wraparound porch, but once they were in the house, it didn't really make any sense that I could hear them as if the footsteps were standing on something that was suspended off the ground. But it wasn't. You're in the house on a concrete slab. And so I hear these footsteps. The door hasn't shut. The front door is wide open. We're in the middle of winter here. We're in the middle of nowhere too. And I'm thinking about that, but I'm still thinking it's got to be Nick's brother, one of Nick's brothers. The footsteps continue through the house. And they stop about halfway through the house. If you open that door and walk halfway through the house. And then the footsteps began to walk down the hallway towards our room. So they come down the hall. And they get right outside the door, which is shut. The door to our room is shut. And I'm sitting there. Again, my feet are closest to the door. It's pitch black in the room, minus the, digital clock. And I'm thinking, why didn't they shut the front door? Of all the weird things that have happened, the fact that I'm hearing footsteps as if they're on the wraparound porch, but they're getting louder and moving through the house, the thing that really just made the hair on the back of my neck stand up was, why didn't they shut the front door? That just seems like such a bad idea. There's animals out there. There's a host of things out there. Like, why aren't you shut? And not to mention, it's freezing outside. There's a space between the bunk bed, the bottom bunk that I'm on, and the top bunk. There's a space that I can see clear as day. Whoever walks in the room, I'm gonna see them when they walk past the foot of the bed. But because of the top bunk, my view is actually obscured, and I wouldn't be able to make out someone's face, for example. I could really only see their middle section. And so when the door opens and this shadow figure walks into the room, which, by the way, I'm in a pitch black room, and I clearly make out a black silhouette. This thing walks into the room, and it's obscured, so I wouldn't have been able to see its head or upper body anyways, but its hips are so high that I can't even really see those. Those are at the level that I would expect someone's upper body or head to be at. Meaning, this figure that's walked in, its legs are extremely long, and so if it was proportionally the size of a human, you're talking about maybe a 10-foot tall person, but we're in a space that is not a 10-foot high ceiling. And so this thing walks in, and as soon as I see it, and I make out that black silhouette, even though it's pitch black in the room, I clearly see this silhouette that is unnaturally tall, combined with all the things that I've just thought about, mainly the door's still open. They've made kind of a commotion. I can hear these weird footsteps. I instantly was frozen with terror. Frozen, petrified. I'm like, it's not Nick's brother. And even if we're not talking about paranormal here, this is such a bad situation. Even if that's just some dude who's come into the house, that's a really bad situation. So no matter what, this is a really bad situation, but what I'm looking at doesn't make sense. It's an unnaturally tall person. They've left the door open, and I hear their footsteps all over the house, and it walks in past the foot of the bed. And I'm laying there, and I can't see higher than its waist because it's obscured by the top bunk. And this thing makes this like facing movement, like a military facing movement, and begins to walk down the aisle between the queen size bed in the middle of the room and the bunk bed where I am. And it's walking down right next to me, and I'm literally sitting there unable to move. And I remember thinking, I can't do anything. I'm truly frozen with terror. And all I remember thinking is, whatever happens, just don't bend down and look at me. That will ruin my life. If this thing so much as looks at me, that's it, I'm done. So it walks down the aisle, and it's right next to me. I'm literally frozen. And it does another quick movement, but it's facing away from me now. Facing towards Nick in the center of the room. And it bows onto and then down through Nick's bed and disappears. In a movie, as soon as the ghost disappears into the floor, whoever's hiding would make a run for it. In real life, there's no such thing as ghosts. There's no such thing as people disappearing into the ground. So I'm expecting this thing to just get back up again. I couldn't understand that it was, what, did it disappear into the bed? That's not possible. Where is it? I heard the door open. I heard the bells. I heard the pot. I heard the footsteps. I saw the door open. I see the thing walk in. I watched it walk down the aisle. I watched it bend over. It's in the room. Where is it? And for hours, all night, I laid there absolutely petrified, expecting this thing to come back up and just look at me. That was my biggest fear, is whatever this thing was, I did not want it to look at me. So that was the worst. I'm laying there frozen. I can only move my eyes all night. Finally, I hear Nick's mom out in the living room making coffee. This was probably like 5, 6 in the morning. And it was like the first time that I'm like, okay, I'm safe now. Even if it's in the room, I'm safe to just go because I can hear someone out there. And I could hear her speaking. I knew it was her. And so I go right out there. And now you got to understand that even though this was a horrible situation that I still can't really explain, I know that she has just lost her husband. And so the idea of approaching this subject, which effectively is going to turn into ghosts, right? I've never had a paranormal experience before this. I've never had a paranormal experience since, right? Like I'm more or less a skeptic, and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to start talking about ghosts to the woman who's recently bereaved. It just felt really inappropriate. And so I was really struggling with how I wanted to communicate what happened. And so I went to the table, she got me a cup of coffee, and and we know each other well, she knows me well. And she definitely picked up that something was wrong, but didn't really ask anything yet. She was just kind of puzzling, like kind of sizing me up a little bit. And the only thing I could think to do was to just ask, hey, did either of your two sons, Nick's older two brothers, did they stop by at any point last night? Did they stop by? And she's like, no. Mm-mm. And I'm sitting there like, okay. And I'm just like, I must have had a reaction that was obvious to her. And she just goes, I heard my husband here last night too. And, that made it a lot worse. Because on the one hand, you have a situation where she is confirming something that part of me hopes is a bad dream. Number two, she's now saying it's her husband. And so I intuitively assumed that she has somehow figured out what I'm stressed about, that probably isn't real. And because she's grieving, she's created a story where her husband is now in the house, looking over us. I really believed that she didn't hear anything, that she just somehow understood that I had this weird feeling and she'd turned it into oh, my husband's in the house. And I just couldn't ask any more questions at that point. I felt like I had set her up for this awkward exchange. I felt really bad that that was the discussion we were having. I also thought if that's true, I don't want to have this conversation. Like, I really was just dumbfounded on what to do in this situation. And this is night 1. There's 2 more nights of this, and it gets worse. So Nick and Wolf eventually come out of the bedroom, and they come to the dining room. And the same way I felt reserved talking to Nick's mom about what happened, I had the same feelings about Nick, because it was his father. And I also just felt like that would be inappropriate. But Wolf, he's not a family member, and he's my buddy, and I kind of pulled him aside, and I kind of told him what was going on as best as I could. But I kept it like kind of generic. I was like, you know, I could have sworn I heard someone in the house last night. Like, I could have sworn. And he's like, yeah, you know, you're probably dreaming. You know, like that's what this is. And I was like, no, like I wasn't, but I can't make sense of it. And I was like, can you just do me a favor? And at this point, Nick actually overheard the conversation, and I very much kind of cut ties with what I was talking about. I was like, yeah, I just thought I heard something last night. It's just me freaking myself out. And I was like, can you guys tonight, when we get back from snowboarding, can I fall asleep ahead of you? That way I'm asleep, you guys can just fall asleep after I do, and then I'll sleep through the night, no big deal. And they're like, all right, yeah, weirdo, whatever. So I'm like, all right, my big plan is I'm just gonna go to bed really, really early. Because I didn't sleep the night before, so I'm thinking, oh, I'll fall asleep right away. So we go out, we snowboard for the day, my mind is off of what happened, and frankly, I'm starting to convince myself that had to have been, you know, sleep paralysis. Even though I'd never had that before, I was Googling some stuff, maybe it was sleep paralysis, maybe it was just like a really intense dream. You know, I would just like, there has to be something. Like this is too weird, it has to be something explainable. Turns out it wasn't. We get back from snowboarding, and I am immediately going to bed. Pretty much immediately. It was like maybe 6 o'clock. I was like, I'm going to bed. And I get in bed, and all I'm thinking about is what happened the night before, and I can't fall asleep. Eventually, Nick and Wolf, they come in the room, and they're trying their best to stay awake so that I can fall asleep, but it's getting later and later, and I can't fall asleep. And now I'm back to that, like, okay, if I fall asleep now, I get 6 hours of sleep. And they finally just said, hey man, I'm tired, I'm going to bed. So they both fall asleep, and I'm awake. And I was so upset with myself. Like, you screwed yourself. Why didn't you just fall asleep, you dummy? And I remember the only thing that I did that really made this real, looking back at it, is I put a knife, like a kitchen knife or something, in the springs above me. So I'm in the bottom bunk, like basically right under the top bunk, I put a knife in there. And I'm laying in bed, and I'm constantly looking over at the digital clock. And it was probably around 3 a.m. It was late enough that it was like, okay, this is about the time that happened last night. And my heart just sunk when I heard those footsteps on the wraparound porch again. They sounded the same as they did the night before. I was like, that has to be one of Nick's brothers. But the door opens, I hear the sleigh bells, I hear the frickin' pot fall on the ground. It was like deja vu. The exact same thing is happening. And these footsteps start walking through the house. And again, referencing how movies would portray this, you know, the person who's me in the movie is like, okay, I'm gonna get this knife and I'm gonna position myself over here because I know what's gonna happen and I'm gonna protect myself. In real life, I'm like, this thing's gonna be in my room, potentially. It happened last night. It's apparently happening again. Please, for the love of God, don't bow into me the way it bowed into the floor the night before. Don't look at me. It will ruin my life if some entity just engages with me, just looks at me. That will ruin my life. This thing walks down the hall, and I hear those footsteps coming down the hall. And just pretend for a second, forget the paranormal aspect. Pretend it's the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere, and a stranger is walking around your house. That alone is horrifying. The footsteps come right outside the door, and I'm looking at the knife that's right underneath the bed. And I'm petrified. I cannot move. I'm drenched in sweat. Just from the few seconds that it's taken this thing to go from the door to the front of my bedroom. because I know what's happening again. It's happening again. I'm not crazy. It's just happening again. What the F is this? And I'm petrified. I can't reach. I'm so worried about making any noise that would alert this thing that I'm here, that I can only move my eyes. And I remember even thinking that I shouldn't move my eyes too quickly because it might hear that. Like, this is a primal level of fear. The door opens. It walks into the room, goes right past the foot of my bed, and I'm, again, petrified. And it walks down, after making its facing movement, it walks down the aisle between me and Nick. And I remember what happened the night before, where it folded into Nick and disappeared, and I'm just thinking to myself, please don't turn and bow into me. Please, whatever happens, just don't do that. So it turns away from me and does the same thing it did the night before, folds onto Nick and disappears into the ground. But again, even though in the movies, this would be the same thing happening, night 2, it's the same routine. It'd be like, oh, the ghost is in the floor now. I can go alert the authorities because now it's safe. In real life, I'm like, where did it go? I know this happened last night, but it still doesn't make any sense. It's in the room. It has to be. This is a real thing. It came in the room. It's somewhere. Is it under my bed? Where is it? All night, I lay there. This is the second night that I've not slept. When I heard Nick's mom out in the other room, it was like such a relief. Because I didn't give a crap at this point about being polite. I wasn't gonna try to, distance myself from the conversation around ghosts. I was gonna go out there and be like, what's wrong with this house? And so I hear her and I go right out to the living room and I tell her everything in as acute detail as I possibly can. And as I'm telling her this, her reaction didn't line up. Her reaction was not surprise, terror, confusion. It was empathy. She felt bad for me. It was sympathy. You don't understand. I'm listening, but you just don't understand what's happening. And I'm telling her every detail I can possibly muster. And at the end of it, or towards the end, she just kind of stops me and she's like, John, I told you yesterday, and again, I heard it last night. That's just my husband. I heard him last night too. You got nothing to worry about. And I was like, no. That cannot be what it is. And she was like, I heard him open the door. I heard the pot fall. I heard him walk through the house. I'm assuming he went into Nick's room again with you guys. And I'm like, what is happening? So totally now just beside myself. I remember I was crying actually. During this conversation, I'm just crying. Not even tears of sadness as much as just what's happening? I needed my mom. I felt so helpless. And no offense to Nick's mom, but I just felt like I was with a lunatic. How? But at the same time, she's recalling the exact same things as me. How do I put that together? I remember thinking, I need to leave. I need to get out of here. I can't be here anymore. But then I thought about how am I going to make this happen? Nick's mom and Wolf and Nick, they're not leaving today. And it was pretty clear that Nick's mom liked the fact that she, heard her husband walking around the cabin. She's not trying to leave. There's one more night that we're here, and I would have to tell my parents to drive, my mom or my dad, to drive to New Hampshire and come get me because I'm seeing ghosts. This was a trip that I loved. I looked forward to this trip every year. It wouldn't have made any sense, and they would have been like, what's wrong with you? And I honestly was not prepared to have those conversations with my mom and dad. I was not prepared to be like, let me tell you about the ghost I saw over the past 2 days. And so I was just kind of resigned and decided to stay. In retrospect, I think I should have called my parents and been like, that's what parents are for. Like, get the hell up here. It doesn't matter why. Come get me. But it was such a confusing moment that I had no blueprint for how to handle. So I just stayed. Nick and Wolf finally get up. And I remember I made that decision as I'm sitting there thinking about what's happening, is Nick's mom is reassuring me, about her husband being in the house. And I make the decision that I'm going to stay. Nick and Wolf come out of the room, and they come over, and Wolf pretty much immediately looks at me to get a gauge on what happened. And you can see it all over my face. I've been crying. And I told them what happened. And, Nick was always kind of a stoic, and he was just unaffected, Wolf, on the other hand, was more inclined to, at a minimum, believe something was happening. He didn't know if it was a ghost or not, but he certainly understood that something's going on. And the fact that Nick's mom, as I'm explaining to Nick and Wolf what's going on, she was like reinforcing my argument. Yeah, I heard him too. I heard the door open. Yeah, I was upstairs. I heard him walk through the house. And Wolf's like, what's going on? And Nick is like, he didn't want to hear it, kind of. It probably was uncomfortable. It's about his father, or ultimately talking about his father. Before we went out snowboarding for the day, because Nick's mom would drive us and drop us off, she brought us to a local store, and we bought a coffee table because they've been looking to replace the one that was in their house. Basically, when you walk into the house, instead of turning down the hallway towards our room, if you just keep walking into the lofted area, at the foot of the stairs was a coffee table where they kept a landline phone, because you're in the middle of nowhere and you got to have some way to call, and they put it right at the foot of the stairs in this little coffee table. But it had broken, or it was old, or whatever. I know that they wanted a new one for a long time. We went out and got it. Me, Nick, and Wolf, we snowboard. We come back. We help offload the coffee table into the house. We put it at the foot of the stairs. And that night, we go to bed. I was ruthless in trying to keep Wolf and Nick awake. I mean, I wasn't even trying to make jokes out of it. I was like straight up kicking the bunk, like kicking Wolf's bunk, like literally shaking Nick. I was doing everything in my power to keep them awake because I couldn't sleep. I'm terrified. It was like the opposite of how excited you get before Christmas and you can't sleep. It was like the opposite of those feelings, but you still can't sleep. It was like, this is the worst night of my life. And also, the nail in the coffin, if you will, is during the day that day, we found out that neither of Nick's two brothers were going to be making the trip. They weren't going to make it. So no one's going to be at the house. No one should be at the house except for us. And so that night I'm laying there, and after all my attempts to keep Nick and Wolf awake, they fall asleep. Everyone's asleep. The house is pitch black. It's silent. And around 2, 3 in the morning, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. I hear those footsteps on the wraparound porch. The door opens and I hear the sleigh bells ringing on the door. A pot falls on the ground and the footsteps walk into the house. And this is the third time that this has happened. So in a way, this was the first time that I was expecting something to happen. For it to walk down the hall, to come in the room, to come next to me, fold into Nick, and then that's it. This was the first time I had a little bit of, call it security, that something was going to happen, and I understood what was going to happen. I didn't understand it, but I expected something to happen. But this was not the case this night. It walked into the house. Everything was the same. It walked into the house, but instead of going down the hallway towards our room, it kept walking into the lofted area. And the lofted area, from where I was laying, my foot's at the door, my head's back here, the wall straight, if I like sat up in bed and looked straight, the wall right there led into the area where this thing was. So I'm basically, if there wasn't a wall, I'd be looking dead at this thing. And I'm waiting for it to walk through the wall. As crazy as that sounds, I'm just anticipating something coming through the wall. After a long pause of it being in that lofted area, I hear it go up the steps. Listening to the creak of the steps as it goes up the steps, it makes my skin crawl. It's making me like emotional thinking about how terrifying that was. It walks up the stairs, And now it's above me. And if the past 2 nights are any example, this thing has sunk into the ground 2 nights in a row and disappeared. And so now my fear is it's going to literally come through the ceiling, through the bunk, onto me. The sound stopped when it was upstairs. Got upstairs, and that's where Nick's mom slept. She was upstairs. So I laid in bed, petrified once again. I got my stupid knife sitting in the underside of the bed above me. And hours and hours of waiting for my literal worst nightmare to come true as some entity comes through the ceiling and goes into me. Or even just if it was like onto Nick, if it came through the ceiling and if out of my peripheries I'm watching like this beast come through the ceiling and float down and into Nick. It just, these thoughts in my head, they didn't make any sense. They were terrifying, but they were happening. I laid in bed and I couldn't fall asleep. I was now coming up on 3 days without sleep. So at some point that night, I did fall asleep, probably just out of sheer exhaustion. At some point in the morning, early morning, now probably like 5 in the morning, I wake up again and I can hear Nick's mom. It didn't sound like she was making coffee. It sounded like something was wrong. I couldn't place it, but it just sounded like she was acting emotional somehow. I couldn't tell if she was crying or not. But now it's like, it's the morning, it's my last day, I'm leaving today, I'm up, I'm out. And as soon as I walk out of the hallway and I look to the left into the dining room where I expect to see Nick's mom, and she's not there. And she's actually over at the foot of the stairs in the lofted kind of living room area next to this new coffee table we had just put in. And she's standing over this coffee table at the foot of the stairs where the entity had been the night before, the one deviation from the other 2 nights. And she's crying. Come here. She points to the coffee table. And she's down on her knees looking at the table. And now I can tell she's probably crying tears of joy. Because scratched into the coffee table were the words, "I love you." I was like, I'm done. That ended my friendships with certainly Nick. Wolf to a lesser degree, but I stopped snowboarding. I didn't go back to that cabin, even though I know Wolf did the next year. The theories about what happened, Nick's mom, it's possible she could have created a narrative, made it about her husband, and then she could have just as easily scratched that into the table. The "I love you," that could have been her. It's also possible that she had sleep paralysis and I had sleep paralysis, and somehow we synchronized and had the same vision and she scratched into the table. Or, to be honest, what I believe, that was a ghost and that it interacted with the physical world and it did walk around the house. It did carve "I love you" into that table. Cranbrook, which is a small snowy town in British Columbia, Canada, used to be a place no one had heard of. Then Isaiah Otieno changed that. In 2006, an 18-year-old smiling young man named Isaiah Otieno stepped off of a plane in Cranbrook and began making his way toward the baggage claim. As he walked, everyone in the airport stopped and stared up at him. Isaiah was 6'9" tall, and he was from Kenya, making him easily one of the most unique people in all of Cranbrook. Isaiah, who was the son of a Kenyan politician, had worked really hard to earn his slot at the local university, called the College of the Rockies. His plan was to use that degree to get a great job so he could help support his family back in Nairobi. Not long after the first semester of Isaiah's freshman year had started, he was not only flourishing academically, but also socially. His big smile and his charm and his incredibly good manners had earned him many friends, as well as the nickname the Gentle Giant. But the person Isaiah most closely bonded with while he was in Cranbrook was another student named Isaac Hockley. Isaac, in addition to being a student at the College of the Rockies, was also a passionate photographer and actually worked part-time for the local newspaper as a freelance photographer. Isaac and Isaiah had briefly met in late 2006 at their campus's billiard halls when they were both playing pool, but that interaction had not made them friends. what had cemented their friendship and made them very, very close was one night in early 2007, Isaiah had gotten a job as a bouncer at a local bar because he's 6'9", and so he was the bouncer, and Isaac had come to that bar, not to see Isaiah, just to go to the bar, and so Isaiah's at the front, he's checking people in, and then he hears this commotion in the bar behind him, and he turns and he sees Isaac is getting attacked by this huge guy that's way stronger than him, who looked like he was the aggressor in the fight. And so without any hesitation, Isaiah turns and just starts galloping into the bar. He's leaping over chairs, he's leaping over tables, and he jumps into the fray, and he fought off Isaac's attacker. And so after the dust settled, Isaac was so thankful for Isaiah, even though Isaiah kind of downplayed it and acted like it was no big deal. But either way, the experience totally bonded these two very different people, and after that, they became totally inseparable. Over the next couple of semesters, the pair would often go off on long rides outside of Cranbrook into the mountains and the forests, and they would just chat. Isaiah would talk about what it was like to live in Kenya and how he was really here to try to be successful like his father, and Isaac would talk to Isaiah about his passion for photography and what it was like growing up in Canada around Cranbrook. On one very memorable drive, the pair were driving at night along this kind of winding road that went through a forest when all of a sudden a moose leapt onto the road and blocked their way, and so Isaac at the last second had to swerve to avoid the moose. But ultimately, they did not get into an accident, and it was just a close call. So Isaac was totally fine. He had kind of recovered within seconds of getting past the moose, but Isaiah, who was in the passenger seat, was totally shaken up by it. And when Isaac started talking to Isaiah about why he was so shaken up, because after all, they are fine, they did not get into an accident, Isaiah would admit that he wasn't shaken up because they almost got into an accident. He was shaken up because he saw a moose. He didn't know moose existed, and so seeing this enormous creature suddenly in the middle of the road right in front of them just had totally spooked him. And so after this, Isaac loved to bring this story up as a way of kind of making fun of Isaiah for his fear of moose, but it was totally in a loving way, and Isaiah would always laugh right along with him. But despite how well everything was going in both Isaiah and Isaac's lives to that point, everything would come crashing down in 2008. On May 13th, 2008, so 2 years after Isaiah showed up in Canada, Isaac got a phone call from his employer, the local newspaper, who told him he needed to head into town to take some pictures of a crash that had just happened. A helicopter had been flying over Cranbrook conducting a power line survey when they had lost power and crashed. And all three people, the pilot and the two people in back who were actually doing the survey, they all died on impact. Isaac, like everybody else who heard about this, was totally shocked. One, because it was totally tragic and horrible, but two, because nothing ever happened in Cranbrook. So to have something so big like this happen right downtown was just unheard of. And so Isaac hopped in his car and he began making his way towards the crash site. And it didn't take long before he saw this massive ring of people right at the intersection between 10th and 14th Street. They were all on the sidewalk and up on buildings, and everyone's just looking in towards this massive mound of jagged metal that was on fire, and all this black smoke was coming off of it, and there's ambulances nearby and police, and the fire department was there, and they're trying to put out the flames, but they can't do it. And so Isaac parks his car and he rushes over to this ring of people, and he works his way towards the front. He pulls out his camera and he began taking pictures, first of the wreckage and the fire, and then also of the police as they put tarps over the bodies. Little did Isaac know, these pictures he was taking were about to take on a whole new significance for him. Earlier that day, just before 1 p.m., Isaiah wrapped up his final class of the day, and after he was done, he remembered he had some letters in his backpack that he had been meaning to mail to his family back in Kenya. And so he decided on his way home, he would make a detour to the post office and he would mail those letters. And so he left the building where this final class was, and he stepped out into the bright sunshine of that May day. He put his headphones on and then he began to walk. At about 1:05 p.m., he arrived at the post office and he went inside just long enough to put his letters in the mail slot, and then he headed back outside. 1 minute later, at 1:06 p.m., as he was crossing 10th Street, the helicopter above lost power and crashed directly on top of Isaiah. Within seconds, he and the three people on board the helicopter would all be dead. It's believed because Isaiah was listening to music on his headphones, he didn't even hear the helicopter as it was crashing down. He was just walking, and then he was dead. It was a total freak accident. It wasn't until later that day that Isaac would realize the pictures he had taken of this scene included pictures of his friend.